For nearly a quarter of a century, the sprawling, labyrinthine corridors of the nation's capital had served as the ultimate stage for a man who had mastered the delicate art of political theater. He was a seasoned representative, a prominent figure who had built an unassailable career entirely upon a foundation of carefully curated words. He possessed a singular, extraordinary talent, the ability to weave a narrative with such absolute, unwavering conviction that the very concept of demanding tangible proof felt almost disrespectful to his captivated audience. From his ambitious early days as a federal prosecutor to his eventual ascension to the chairmanship of a highly powerful intelligence oversight committee, every step of his upward trajectory was meticulously paved with bold accusations and sweeping rhetoric. He moved through the halls of power with the distinct, polished confidence of a lead actor who intimately knew every line of a script that remained invisible to everyone else. Over the years, he had sat beneath the bright studio lights of every major broadcasting network, staring directly into the camera lenses to assure the American public that he held definitive, irrefutable evidence of systemic corruption at the highest echelons of government. He had confidently spoken of international collusion, of clandestine financial networks, and of unprecedented threats to the Republic. He would frequently emerge from the heavily fortified, soundproof vaults where the nation's most sensitive intelligence briefings were held, immediately striding toward the waiting press corps to offer grave, carefully worded hints that magically mirrored highly classified materials. The media ecosystem had consistently rewarded his performances with applause, primetime slots, and a veneer of unquestionable credibility. He had operated for decades under the comforting assumption that his narrative control was absolute, and that true, uncompromising accountability was a concept meant only for his adversaries. However, the dawn of a crisp Tuesday morning in Washington brought with it an entirely unfamiliar paradigm. The atmosphere inside the historic Russell Senate Office building was thick, almost suffocating, with a nervous, electric anticipation. The massive hearing room, adorned with rich, dark mahogany paneling and heavy velvet drapery, was packed to its absolute capacity. Seasoned political commentators, veteran journalists, and nervous legislative aides stood shoulder to shoulder, their hushed murmurs blending into a continuous, anxious hum. The physical space itself carried a profound, heavy irony. It was the exact type of ornate, heavily camera-equipped environment where the representative had spent the zenith of his career operating as the star inquisitor. He knew the acoustic dead spots of these rooms, he knew exactly which angles favored the high-definition lenses, and he knew how to wield the chairman's gavel like a weapon of mass intimidation. But today, the seating arrangement was fundamentally altered. He was the one who had arrogantly demanded this specific inquiry, drafting a highly publicized letter to challenge the qualifications of the newly appointed Director of National Intelligence. He had expected a triumphant coronation, a platform to further cement his legacy as the ultimate defender of institutional integrity. He was entirely oblivious to the reality that he had meticulously engineered his own political autopsy. His entrance into the chamber was a masterclass in calculated optics. He chose to walk through the brightly lit main corridor, ensuring the maximum number of press cameras could capture his arrival. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his expression hardened into a mask of solemn determination. He was flanked by a dedicated entourage of senior staff members who dutifully carried thick, imposing binders filled with rehearsed questions, counter-arguments, and strategic messaging points. He absorbed the flashing bulbs and the shouted questions of reporters as his rightful due, taking his seat at the witness table with the practiced grace of a monarch returning to his throne. 30 minutes prior, entirely unnoticed by the scrambling press pool, the newly appointed director had arrived through a discreet, unadorned side entrance. She did not command a sprawling entourage, nor had she pre-positioned any media allies to capture her arrival. She was a highly decorated combat veteran, a woman who had built her formidable reputation not on rhetorical flourishes, but on decades of tangible, perilous service in active operational theaters. She carried no imposing binders of political strategy. Instead, she brought only a single, unassuming leather briefcase. When she took her seat directly across the expansive wooden table from the representative, the profound contrast between the two figures anchored the room. On one side sat a man whose entire existence was defined by the manipulation of public perception. On the other sat a woman backed by the full, terrifying authority of the United States intelligence apparatus, completely uninterested in the performative aspects of the Capitol. As the committee chairman struck his heavy wooden gavel to officially call the highly anticipated proceedings to order, the major broadcasting networks suspended their regular programming, instantly cutting to a live, uninterrupted feed. Following parliamentary custom, the representative was invited to deliver his opening remarks. He stood up from his heavy leather chair, not out of any procedural necessity, but driven by a deeply ingrained, calculated habit to physically dominate the visual frame whenever the red recording lights were illuminated. He adjusted his microphone with absolute precision, buttoned his jacket, and launched into a sweeping 15-minute monologue. By any standard of political theater, it was a flawless, mesmerizing performance. He systematically attacked the director's professional qualifications with surgical precision, utilizing carefully worded insinuations to question her loyalty to the state. He painted a dramatic, emotionally charged picture of a nation teetering on the brink of ruin, portraying himself as the sole, courageous sentinel, standing guard against the encroaching darkness. His voice rose and fell with perfect dramatic timing, drawing visible, sympathetic nods of agreement from his aligned colleagues seated around the elevated dais. It was a quarter hour of compelling, unbroken, narrative dominance. When he finally concluded, he lowered himself back into his seat, smoothly adjusted his silk tie, and gazed across the polished expanse of the table at the director. His face wore the deeply satisfied, patronizing expression of a seasoned commander who firmly believed he had just dictated the insurmountable terms of the impending engagement. The director did not react. She did not reach for her microphone, nor did she adjust her posture. 5 agonizingly long seconds slowly ticked by, dissolving the lingering echoes of his speech. Then 10 seconds passed. The silence that descended upon the grand chamber was so absolute, so profoundly unnerving, that the ambient, mechanical hum of the building's massive climate control system suddenly became the loudest sound on the national television broadcast. Finally, breaking the suffocating tension, the director spoke. Her vocal tone was incredibly calm, evenly measured, and chillingly devoid of the soaring, emotional inflection the representative had just utilized to such great effect. She simply asked if he had finished. The representative nodded slightly, a patronizing, confident smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. He confirmed that he believed he had made his initial position abundantly clear to the committee. The director softly agreed, her eyes locking onto his. She observed that over the preceding 15 minutes, he had accomplished precisely what he had been doing for the last 7 years. He had spoken with tremendous, captivating confidence while simultaneously presenting absolutely zero substantive evidence to support his grandiose claims. The self-assured smile on the representative's face noticeably flickered, the first infinitesimal crack in his carefully hardened facade. The profound difference between this specific morning and every other day over the past 7 years, the director continued while methodically reaching for her leather briefcase, was that the person currently sitting directly across from him actually possessed the evidence he so desperately lacked. With a series of sharp, metallic clicks that echoed clearly through the silent room, she unlatched the briefcase. She deliberately removed 5 thick, distinctively colored folders, red, blue, black, white, and a noticeably voluminous yellow one. She arranged them in a highly precise, meticulously aligned row on the polished wood directly in front of her. Each folder bore prominent, unmistakable classification markings and the heavy, authenticating seals of official federal investigative agencies. The representative instinctively leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing, his body language betraying a sudden spike in adrenaline as he attempted to decipher the bold text printed on the respective labels. The director caught the subtle, anxious movement. She calmly assured him there was no need to strain his eyes, promising that he would be afforded the opportunity to deeply review the devastating contents of each dossier in sequential order. She placed her right hand firmly upon the cover of the bright red folder. She announced to the completely silent, captivated room that the inquiry would commence by systematically examining the established public record of his untruths. She opened the red folder with the deliberate, terrifying precision of an operator executing a thoroughly planned maneuver. The contents housed within were not highly classified surveillance photographs or covert foreign intercepts. They were standard, undeniably public documents. They were crisp paper printouts consisting of official transcripts from primetime television appearances, verified congressional records, and widely broadcast public statements. Before producing a single sheet of paper, she established a crucial, inescapable parameter. She clarified to the committee that every single document within this initial dossier was a matter of established public record. She did not need to invoke any special executive declassification authority because the overwhelming evidence of his persistent, systemic dishonesty was freely available to any citizen possessing a standard television set. The true tragedy, she noted, her gaze sweeping across the elevated dais, was not that his deceptions had been brilliantly hidden in the shadows. The failure was that no one in the esteemed legislative body had ever possessed the fortitude to compile his own words into a single, chronological timeline and force him to look at them. She withdrew the first chronological artifact. It was a transcript from a premiere Sunday morning broadcast, dating back several years. She read his exact, quoted words back into the microphone, his voice echoing back at him in her steady cadence. She highlighted his definitive past assertion that the case for international collusion was far more substantial than mere rumor, explicitly emphasizing his claim of possessing more than circumstantial evidence. She coldly set the paper down and immediately picked up the next. She recited a transcript from the following month, emphasizing his bold, televised assurance that there was an ample, overwhelming abundance of evidence hiding in plain sight. She continued this relentless, methodical process, pulling transcript after transcript. She highlighted statements where he grandly announced the launch of sweeping financial investigations, confidently telling the weary public that his committee had already uncovered highly significant proof of treacherous coordination. She arranged these individual printouts in a neat, overlapping row across her desk, ensuring the bolded text was clearly visible to the battery of high-definition cameras. Then, she reached back into the red folder to retrieve a second, contrasting stack of documents. These papers were heavy, bound, and bore the authenticating seals of independent prosecutorial bodies. She announced that the time had come to brutally contrast his dramatic, televised assertions with the concrete, verified findings of the actual multi-million-dollar federal investigations. She held up the first weighty report, generated by an appointed special counsel. She coldly recited the massive operational statistics, an investigation spanning 2 full years, costing the taxpayers $40 million, and involving interviews with 600 witnesses. She then read the ultimate, inescapable conclusion. Directly from the executive summary, the exhaustive investigation had completely failed to establish that any conspiracy or coordination had ever occurred. She placed the heavy report down and picked up at the subsequent investigation's findings. This secondary report concluded that the premier federal law enforcement agency had lacked any proper, legally sound basis for initiating their sweeping counterintelligence operation to begin with, noting the entire foundational theory was dangerously built upon raw, uncorroborated rumors. Moving systematically to the next official document, she highlighted the deeply concerning findings of an independent inspector general. This exhaustive review of the highly sensitive surveillance warrant applications had uncovered an astonishing 17 significant material errors and deliberate omissions, confirming that the federal court had been intentionally misled. She meticulously lined up these official, devastating government findings directly opposite the row of his television transcripts. It created a breathtaking, side-by-side, visual representation of his career's central illusion. One row consisting entirely of his grandiose, alarming claims, and a parallel row consisting of the definitive, official conclusions that scientifically proved every single one of his claims to be entirely false. The representative, his breathing now visibly shallow, immediately attempted to aggressively interject. His voice rose in a panicked crescendo as he accused the director of taking complex intelligence findings completely out of context, desperately attempting to pivot the conversation toward broad foreign adversary assessments. The director's voice sliced through his frantic interruption with terrifying precision. She did not raise her volume. Instead, she dropped her pitch to a register of absolute, icy authority. She informed him directly that the current topic of discussion was not the actions of any foreign nation. The topic was his own behavior, specifically the demonstrably false statements he had repeatedly, knowingly made on camera to the American people. She waited in silence for 3 full seconds, daring him to interrupt again. When he remained paralyzed, she produced a final, bound compilation document from the red folder. She explained that her investigative staff had prepared a comprehensive media analysis covering a 4-year window of his career. The staggering data revealed that he had appeared on national television broadcasting platforms an astounding 423 times, solely to discuss the fabricated collusion narrative. During every single one of those 423 separate appearances, he had explicitly stated, or heavily implied, that he had personally reviewed secret, damning evidence that the general public was not yet permitted to see. With a quiet, devastating finality, she closed the red folder. The sharp snap of the cardboard cover echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She delivered the concluding assessment of the first phase, noting that while he had required 423 television appearances and the undivided attention of the national media to convince the country of a massive, non-existent political conspiracy, she had only required 10 minutes with the verified public record to definitively prove he had been lying every single time he opened his mouth. The representative stared at the closed red folder, his famous rhetorical agility entirely abandoning him. And yet, the director's hand was already moving slowly, deliberately, toward the bright blue dossier. The ambient energy within the cavernous hearing room had shifted fundamentally, irrevocably. The moment the heavy cardboard cover of the red folder snapped shut, the seasoned political reporters seated in the elevated press gallery were no longer casually monitoring the proceedings while scrolling through their mobile devices. They were now physically leaning far over the polished brass railings, their postures rigid with disbelief. Several correspondents had abandoned their seats entirely, standing in the narrow, carpeted aisles, frantically typing rapid, breathless updates to their respective editorial desks. The atmosphere had transitioned from the routine boredom of a standard legislative inquiry into the electric, suffocating tension of a high-stakes tribunal. The senators seated along the curved wooden dais were observing the unfolding scene with the intense, unblinking focus of individuals who acutely understood they were witnessing something terrifyingly historic. They were watching the systematic, public execution of a political titan's legacy. The representative himself sat rigidly in his leather chair, desperately attempting to project an aura of unbothered defiance. However, his physical betrayals were becoming impossible to conceal. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle pulsed erratically beneath his pale cheek. It was a defensive posture that television viewers across the nation would later dissect frame by frame, debating whether the look in his eyes was born of stubborn, arrogant indignation or sheer, paralyzing terror. He swallowed hard, his throat audibly dry, his eyes tracking the director's hands as they moved deliberately away from the red dossier. Without a word, the director's fingers grazed the vibrant surface of the bright blue folder. When she opened it, the contents revealed a stark departure from the crisp, printed transcripts of the previous round. Inside was not a stack of paper, but a sleek, black, digital tablet. The room collectively held its breath. Addressing the committee chairman with formal, unwavering deference, she formally requested parliamentary permission to broadcast a specific piece of multimedia evidence pulled directly from the public congressional archives. She specifically cited a highly contentious, globally televised committee hearing from a few years prior, a hearing that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the nation. Once the chairman swiftly granted permission, the massive, high-definition monitors mounted along the ornate walls of the hearing room suddenly flickered to life. The screens displayed a slightly younger version of the representative, sitting at the very apex of his legislative power. He was occupying the elevated chairman's seat during a globally broadcast impeachment proceeding. It was the absolute seat of authority, the very throne from which he had spent years meticulously constructing the towering narrative that he stood as the Republic's final, desperate line of defense against unprecedented executive corruption. The digitized version of the representative began speaking, his voice booming through the room, state-of-the-art sound system. He spoke with the smooth, practiced, intoxicating cadence of a veteran trial lawyer, delivering a devastating closing argument to a captivated jury. He confidently informed his audience that he was about to present the absolute, terrifying essence of a highly controversial diplomatic phone call between the executive and a foreign head of state. The director let the video play, allowing the representative's own voice to fill the silence. On the massive screens, the digital senator narrated the exchange, his vocal tone subtly shifting to perform a mocking, menacing impression of the executive. He dramatically described a scene of overt extortion, inventing coercive threats, demanding illicit political favors, and portraying a ruthless shakedown that possessed absolutely no basis in the actual, verified, and declassified transcript of the call. He deliberately presented this creative, highly damaging fiction as established historical fact before an audience of millions of deeply concerned citizens. The occupants of the present-day hearing room watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence. When the dramatic clip concluded, the director seamlessly cued a second video. This shorter clip featured a bewildered, frustrated colleague at that exact same historical hearing, interrupting the grandstanding to ask the chairman, in genuine, on-the-record disbelief, if he was simply making the quotes up out of thin air. The director coldly affirmed to the silent room that he was, indeed, fabricating the entire exchange. She then played the third and final clip. It showcased the representative's own defensive, backtracking response when later cornered by the press about his immense creative liberties. The screens showed him nervously attempting to dismiss his grave misrepresentation of a presidential communication, awkwardly claiming with a strained smile that his summary was meant, at least partially, as a humorous parody. The director paused the playback. The digital image froze, trapping the representative's defensive, shifting expression on the massive 10-foot-tall monitors looming over the chamber. The hearing room remained enveloped in a suffocating, heavy silence. The actual, present-day representative sitting defensively in the witness chair was forced to stare upward at the colossal image of his own face, agonizingly watching his past self deliver a manipulative, cynical performance that had directly triggered a constitutional crisis. The director slowly repeated his chosen defense, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to the furthest corners of the gallery. Parody. She allowed the absurdly inadequate, almost insulting word to hang heavily in the tense atmosphere. She contextualized the profound gravity of his actions, her tone stripping away the polite veneer of political maneuvering. She reminded the hushed room that the powerful chairman of an intelligence oversight committee, during a solemn, formal constitutional proceeding that would ultimately lead to the unprecedented impeachment of a sitting executive, had deliberately chosen to read a completely fabricated, highly inflammatory version of a diplomatic communication into the permanent historical record of the United States. And when his deception was inevitably exposed, his only defense was to claim he was performing a comedic sketch. Turning her intense, unyielding gaze entirely away from the monitors, she focused solely on the visibly shaking man sitting across from her. She spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of someone who had witnessed the true, bloody cost of institutional failure. She reminded him that she had served her country in active, brutal combat zones. She explained, with chilling clarity, that in an operational theater of war, when a person in authority deliberately misrepresents vital intelligence, or when they fabricate critical information and present it as verified fact to their superiors, the result is never a humorous misunderstanding. The result is a catastrophic loss of human life. She stated fiercely, her eyes locking onto his, that in the military, such cynical actions are never dismissed as parody. They are prosecuted as a grave, unforgivable dereliction of duty that directly gets Americans killed. The representative surged upward from his heavy chair. The movement was not slow, nor was it deliberate. He stood up abruptly, violently, the heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He looked exactly like a desperate, cornered courtroom attorney throwing a wild, baseless objection to block the devastating introduction of a murder weapon. He loudly demanded a point of order, his voice cracking slightly, the polished veneer finally shattering. He practically shouted at the committee chairman, frantically arguing that the current line of questioning was entirely irrelevant to the officially stated purpose of the hearing, insisting that the director was launching a personalized, vindictive inquisition. The chairman of the committee, a seasoned politician who instantly sensed the historic, career-ending gravity of the moment, reached for his heavy wooden gavel. He struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that silenced the representative's frantic protests. He forcefully ordered the panicking lawmaker to be seated, officially recognizing that the director still rightfully held the floor and that her testimony would continue uninterrupted. The representative stubbornly remained standing for 3 tense, agonizing seconds. It was a petty, desperate act of political defiance. He was trying to reclaim the physical dominance he had relied upon for decades. But the numerous high-definition lenses surrounding the room mercilessly captured every micro-expression of his rapidly crumbling facade. He was a once untouchable lawmaker, visibly refusing to sit when ordered, his jaw muscles clenching rapidly as his panicked eyes darted wildly between the stern, unforgiving face of the chairman and the frozen, embarrassing image of his past self still looming on the monitors above. Finally, moving with an exaggerated, trembling slowness, entirely designed to falsely communicate that he was choosing to comply rather than being forced into submission, he lowered himself back onto the leather cushion. But the devastating, permanent visual had already been broadcast to millions. The man who had spent his entire adult life ruthlessly controlling investigative hearings from the elevated chairman's seat. The man who dictated the rules of engagement had just been unceremoniously ordered to sit down like a reprimanded child. His legendary, razor-sharp rhetorical agility had been instantly, humiliatingly silenced by the simple, authoritative strike of a wooden mallet. The director smoothly resumed her presentation, her voice perfectly even, acting entirely as if his desperate, flailing outburst had never occurred. She noted that his disastrous attempt at parody was not merely an isolated lapse in judgment driven by the heat of the moment. It was, she asserted, a vital, meticulously planned component of a much larger, systemic pattern of theatrical deception. Reaching back into the blue folder, she withdrew a thick stack of printed emails. She held them up for the committee to see. These were not public records. They were internal, highly sensitive communications bearing the unmistakable digital metadata watermarks of official congressional servers. She announced that her investigative team had utilized lawful, rigorous oversight channels to obtain a massive trove of digital communications strictly detailing the hidden coordination between his senior congressional staff and prominent, partisan political operatives in the crucial, frantic weeks leading up to the historic impeachment proceedings. She began reading directly from the chronologically arranged documents, systematically exposing a cynical, highly organized messaging strategy that treated the Constitution like a television script. The emails detailed exactly how specific, emotionally charged talking points were simultaneously distributed to both his legislative office and a carefully curated network of friendly media contacts. The documents revealed intricate, synchronized timing schedules designed to ensure his dramatic public statements perfectly coincided with pre-written, highly polished news articles that would miraculously appear online within minutes of his remarks. Articles that were far too detailed and structurally complex to have been drafted in real time. She read a particularly damning email dated just 6 days before his infamous parody performance. His own communications director had explicitly instructed partisan operatives that the chairman desired maximum emotional impact for his opening statement. The staffer admitted in black and white that they were actively drafting a narrative that captured the abstract essence of the allegations rather than relying on direct, factual quotes, and desperately requested that the media network be primed to amplify the emotional narrative immediately upon delivery. She then read the enthusiastic, coordinated response from the partisan operatives, confirming that major cable news networks had already been fully briefed and had aligned panels of sympathetic commentators waiting on standby. Prominent national newspapers already possessed draft analysis pieces ready for publication, merely waiting to coordinate the exact timing of the release to maximize the political shockwave. She concluded this devastating sequence by reading a final email sent by his own chief of staff to the entire office on the very eve of the hearing. The chief of staff had cynically described the impending constitutional proceeding, one of the most severe and solemn mechanisms in the American Republic, not as a grave duty, but as the performance of a lifetime. The email coldly instructed the staff that the chairman's opening remarks were designed to artificially set the entire national narrative, and that their sole job moving forward was to ruthlessly maintain the emotional reality they were about to establish on camera. The director slowly looked up from the damning stack of printed emails. She repeated the phrase, letting it echo off the mahogany walls. Performance of a lifetime. She allowed the cynical terminology used by his own closest advisors to sink deeply into the minds of the horrified committee members. She looked directly at the representative and accused him of fundamentally corrupting the oversight process. She stated that he had not pursued his investigations because the strict demands of the Constitution required it, or because national security was genuinely threatened. He had produced a massive, taxpayer-funded show simply because the television ratings, the fundraising metrics, and the partisan fervor demanded it. And when the verified, tedious facts of the case failed to provide sufficient cinematic drama for his grand production, he had simply written a fictional script and forcefully inserted those lies into the official record. She paused briefly. When she spoke again, her vocal register dropped to an even quieter, more intimate level. that somehow managed to project more terrifying weight than if she had been shouting through a megaphone. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the desk. The fundamental difference between a dedicated prosecutor and a stage actor, she observed with glacial calmness, is that a true prosecutor actually cares whether the underlying evidence is real. She let the silence hold the room captive for one long, agonizing heartbeat. "You," she whispered, "never did." With calculated, terrifying finality, she moved her hand away from the blue folder and rested it upon the ominous, heavy black folder. The representative, who had been white-knuckling the edge of the heavy wooden table with both hands to stop them from visibly shaking, audibly swallowed hard. She then announced that the inquiry would now pivot away from his political theater and move into the shadows to examine the specific, deeply troubling origins of his financial backing. The sudden introduction of the black folder into the formal congressional record landed in the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the hearing room, with the devastating, invisible impact of a live explosive device. The first two rounds of the director's methodical presentation had systematically exposed the representative's professional lies and cynical political performances. Those were, in the grand scheme of Washington, survivable offenses. Politicians routinely survived hypocrisy. But as her hand rested upon the dark leather binding of the third dossier, the emotional weight carried in her voice noticeably shifted. The inquiry is no longer merely about misquoted transcripts or strategic media leaks. It was preparing to delve into a realm where political ambition intersected with profound human tragedy. The representative's physical reaction was immediate, visceral, and entirely involuntary. He visibly jolted backward in his heavy leather chair. It was not a dramatic, theatrical flailing, but a sharp, undeniable retreat that the high-definition cameras easily captured and instantly broadcast to millions of captivated viewers. It was the very first instance during the grueling hours of the tribunal that his physical body had reacted in pure, unadulterated panic, before his famously agile mind could formulate a rhetorical defense. The director opened the black folder with the exact same methodical, terrifying precision she had applied to the others. She began by factually establishing the identity of the individual in question. She did not raise her voice, she let the horrific facts carry their own devastating weight. She described a prominent, highly influential mega-donor and financial bundler for the political establishment. This individual had aggressively funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into various candidate coffers, allied political action committees, and aligned ideological causes over the span of a deeply influential, untouchable career. She then stated his current, grim status. The donor had been decisively convicted on multiple severe federal felony charges several years prior, and was presently serving a multi-decade sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. She paused deliberately, allowing the stark, undeniable reality of his criminal status to firmly establish itself in the room before drawing the inescapable, damning connection to the defensive man sitting across from her. Using careful, measured language that conveyed the absolute horror of the situation without violating the dignity of the congressional hearing, she outlined the deeply disturbing nature of the wealthy benefactor's crimes. She described a predatory, systematic pattern of behavior. The convicted donor had utilized his vast wealth, his political insulation, and his societal influence to lure vulnerable, marginalized individuals to his residence. There, they were subjected to severe, non-consensual chemical abuse designed to fulfill his darkest predatory gratifications. She noted, her voice dropping to a solemn register, that this horrific pattern of exploitation had directly resulted in the tragic, entirely preventable deaths of multiple innocent individuals. The silence that fell over the grand hearing room was absolute, heavy, and asphyxiating. This was no longer a televised debate over partisan political theater. These were dead citizens, producing verified Federal Election Commission records from the depths of the black folder. The director continued her relentless presentation. She revealed that among the extensive list of powerful politicians who had eagerly accepted and utilized this predator's tainted financial contributions was the representative himself. She held the specific, authenticated financial filing up high, ensuring the glowing red lights of the broadcast cameras could capture the undeniable proof of the direct campaign contributions. The representative, desperate to regain even a sliver of narrative control and preserve his carefully curated image as a champion of the vulnerable, immediately activated his microphone. His voice carried the distinctly hollow, over-rehearsed quality of a crisis management response that had been drafted by a legal team years in advance. He rapidly asserted that he had dutifully donated the equivalent sum of that specific contribution to a reputable charitable organization immediately after the donor's highly publicized arrest. He aggressively insisted that his philanthropic action was a widely known matter of public record, demanding that the committee officially acknowledge his moral high ground. The director calmly agreed that his eventual charitable donation was indeed a matter of public record. However, she continued, withdrawing a large, professionally formatted document from the folder, the actual problem lay within the chronological timeline of those events, a timeline that told a deeply disturbing story of complicity that he had never been forced to publicly explain. She laid the detailed chronological timeline flat on the desk. It was meticulously divided into two stark columns. The left column detailed the tragic, escalating sequence of events occurring at the donor's residence, while the right column documented the corresponding actions or glaring lack thereof taken by the representative. She traced her finger down the document, beginning with the date of the first tragic fatality at the donor's apartment. She noted that while local authorities had initially misclassified the horrific event, the victim's grieving family, alongside numerous civil rights organizations and marginalized community activists, had immediately begun publicly demanding a thorough criminal investigation. They had loudly, desperately warned the political establishment that the donor was a dangerous serial predator. She then moved her finger to the right column, directly across from the date of the first tragedy. She pointed out that the space was entirely blank. She stated with brutal, uncompromising clarity that his response to the first death and the desperate cries of the community he loudly claimed to represent on television was absolute, deafening silence. There were no public statements of concern issued from his office, no immediate returns of the tainted financial contributions, and no effort whatsoever to distance his political brand from the accused predator. She continued charting the devastating timeline through the subsequent year. As multiple courageous survivors began coming forward to law enforcement, detailing the donor's horrific pattern of captivity, the public outcry intensified. Court records began publicly documenting the severe allegations. Community activists organized protests and circulated massive petitions, begging the political establishment to reject the donor's blood money. The director looked up from the document and locked eyes with the representative, noting that the right column of the timeline remained stubbornly, unforgivably empty throughout this entire period of escalating horror. She accused him of deliberately choosing to retain the financial contributions while remaining entirely silent. He had offered no public condemnation, expressed no sympathy for the deceased, and provided no support for the brave survivors who were desperately trying to sound the alarm. She then moved her finger to the date of the second tragic fatality. Another vulnerable individual found deceased, in the exact same location, under the exact same horrific circumstances. Even then, the timeline showed his office did absolutely nothing. It was not until nearly 2 years after the initial tragedy, she noted with dripping disdain, and only after a third victim narrowly survived, and the donor was finally taken into federal custody in a massive public spectacle, that the representative finally decided to quietly transfer the funds to charity. She set the timeline down heavily. She summarized his devastating moral bankruptcy. He had knowingly held on to financial contributions from an individual whose residence was a suspected crime scene for 2 entire years. He had only chosen to act when the donor's highly publicized arrest made his continued financial association politically suicidal. The representative's hand slipped nervously beneath the heavy wooden table. The director's sharp eyes tracked the subtle, desperate movement instantly. Though she did not pause her presentation, by this point, his hand was clearly gripping his smartphone beneath the table, hidden from the direct view of the gallery, but obvious to anyone paying close attention to his shifting posture. He was staring down at his lap, desperately avoiding eye contact. The director paused her presentation. The room held its breath. She directly, calmly asked him who he was, frantically attempting to message under the table his defense attorney or the crisis management team responsible for drafting his rapidly deteriorating talking points. The representative's head snapped up sharply. His pale face contorted into an expression caught halfway between genuine outrage and sheer, unadulterated panic. It was the unmistakable, deeply humiliating look of a powerful man who had just been publicly caught attempting to execute a clandestine maneuver. The director's voice softened slightly, losing its aggressive, interrogative edge. But the resulting tone of profound pity was somehow vastly more devastating. She gently suggested that he put the device away, softly assuring him that absolutely no one was coming to rescue him from this room today. Defeated, utterly stripped of his dignity, he slowly brought his trembling hands back above the table, placing them flat on the polished wood. Having dismantled his moral standing, the director closed the black folder. She immediately reached for the stark white dossier, announcing that the inquiry would now escalate beyond political hypocrisy and moral failure, and enter the severe, unforgiving realm of federal criminal conduct. As she opened the white folder, the seasoned senators serving on the committee instantly recognized the distinctive, alarming formatting of the documents inside. They bore the highly restrictive, brightly colored warning banners associated with the nation's most sensitive intelligence operations. They contained dense metadata analysis logs, secure facility access manifests, and rigorous internal security protocols. The director's demeanor underwent an instantaneous transformation. She abandoned the cadence of a political interrogator and adopted the clipped, precise, and utterly uncompromising tone of a senior intelligence officer, delivering a critical operational briefing regarding an active, severe internal threat. She began by meticulously establishing the extraordinary level of access the representative had commanded during his tenure as the powerful chairman of the Intelligence Oversight Committee. For several crucial years, he had occupied one of the most sensitive, heavily cleared positions within the entire architecture of the United States government. He possessed unrestricted access to highly compartmented, deeply classified intelligence programs, utilizing secure, soundproof vaults, SCIFs, to receive highly sensitive briefings from every major element of the global intelligence apparatus. She then produced a massive, densely printed spreadsheet. It was a comprehensive compilation of his personal access records to the secure intelligence facilities, meticulously detailing the exact dates, precise entry and exit times, the specific duration of his visits, and the extreme classification level of the delicate materials he had reviewed. She ran her finger down the seemingly endless column of data, highlighting a specific morning where he had spent nearly 2 hours inside the secure vault, reviewing highly classified briefings regarding sensitive, ongoing counterintelligence operations. Moving with deliberate intent, she produced a second, distinct document and positioned it directly alongside the first. This new document was an exhaustive compilation of major media reports that contained highly specific, sensitive details, details that could only have theoretically originated from the very classified briefings the representative had just attended. She aligned the two intricate documents so the specific dates and timestamps were perfectly parallel, creating an undeniable visual timeline of unauthorized, illegal disclosure. She pointed to the first entry, noting that his visit to the secure vault had concluded late in the morning. She then traced her finger across to the second document, revealing that less than 3 hours later, a major cable news network had suddenly published an exclusive breaking report containing highly specific, deeply sensitive details regarding the exact same counterintelligence operations that had been discussed behind closed vault doors earlier that day. She relentlessly marched down the timeline, exposing instance after instance. A morning briefing focused on deeply classified foreign signals intelligence was miraculously followed by a major newspaper publishing a highly detailed article concerning that exact same signals intelligence before dinner time. An afternoon briefing concerning clandestine surveillance programs was directly linked to a prime-time cable television segment broadcasting those exact same surveillance details just hours later. She exposed 5 examples, then 8, ultimately arriving at a staggering total of 12 separate, fully documented instances of classified leaks. The undeniable pattern was mathematically perfect. The representative would enter the secure vault, receive a highly classified briefing, and within a matter of hours, his media allies would miraculously publish that exact same information. The representative's face had completely hardened into a forced, unnatural blankness. But the director calmly stated that the devastating evidence went far beyond mere suspicious timing. She revealed that the intelligence community, operating under lawful authority, had conducted a massive, comprehensive metadata analysis of all electronic communications originating from the devices officially registered to his legislative office during the highly specific time windows. Immediately following his visits to the secure vault, she produced a complex, visually dense metadata chart, explicitly noting that this was purely metadata. The irrefutable digital footprints of his communications, the specific numbers dialed, the exact times of connection, the precise durations of the calls. She stated with absolute, chilling certainty that the resulting digital pattern was as unique and undeniable as a human fingerprint. The analysis proved that, in 10 of the 12 documented instances of classified leaks, communication devices directly associated with his office had successfully contacted the specific mobile devices of prominent journalists working for the exact networks that subsequently published the leaked information. These digital connections occurred entirely within the narrow, highly suspicious window of time between his exit from the secure vault and the publication of the stories. The illicit communications occurred an average of 47 minutes after he departed the secure briefings, lasting precisely long enough to verbally convey complex, substantive intelligence details without triggering automated monitoring alarms. The representative desperately reached for his microphone. His trembling hand hovered over the activation button for an agonizing moment, a physical manifestation of his internal debate between fighting back and maintaining his legal right to silence. Finally, in a deliberate, highly visible gesture of utter defeat, he pushed the microphone far away from him. He announced in a weak, unamplified voice that he would not dignify the presentation with a response. The grand hearing room immediately fell into a profound, heavy silence. The sudden, stark absence of his famously confident voice was suddenly the most deafening sound in the entire building. The director allowed the humiliating silence to stretch out, letting the reality of his surrender wash over the room. She observed with quiet devastation that for the very first time in 24 years of highly visible public life, he had absolutely nothing to say. She then casually outlined the severe legal consequences of the evidence she had just presented. She noted with clinical detachment that the unauthorized, deliberate disclosure of highly classified national security information constitutes a severe federal crime under the Espionage Act. She looked slowly from the devastating metadata chart back to the defeated man slumping in his chair. She reminded him of the simple, terrifying arithmetic 12 separate, documented instances of severe security breaches multiplied by a potential maximum penalty of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for each count. She returned the highly classified documents to the stark white folder and secured it shut. She accused him of taking the incredibly dangerous, hard-won information that brave intelligence officers had literally risked their lives to collect in the field, and cheaply trading it as illicit currency to purchase favorable, flattering coverage from his media allies. He had treated the ultimate sacrifice of the intelligence community as nothing more than raw, disposable material to endlessly fuel his own self-aggrandizing political narratives. With that, she placed her hand firmly upon the final, massive yellow folder. As the director's hand came to rest upon the final, massive yellow folder, a cold, predatory stillness settled over the hearing room. The previous 3 rounds had systematically dismantled the representative's public persona, his moral standing, and his legal immunity. But the yellow folder represented the final, absolute unraveling of his entire professional universe. It was the thickest of the 5, and its contents promised to move beyond individual transgressions into the realm of systemic, coordinated subversion. The director opened the folder. Instead of a stack of documents, she withdrew a large, industrial-sized, multi-folded diagram. It was the exact type of organizational chart utilized by elite intelligence agencies to map the cellular structures of hostile foreign networks. An assistant stepped forward to help mount the massive, complex chart onto a sturdy wooden easel, positioned so that every television camera in the room could capture its intricate detail in high definition. At the very center of the diagram, encased in a stark circle larger than any other node, was a single name, the representatives. Radiating outward from this central hub were thick, color-coded branches connecting to 4 distinct operational categories: media assets, political operatives, sympathetic intelligence contacts, and illicit financial networks. The representatives stared at the chart with a look of genuine, unadulterated shock. He wasn't looking at a political attack. He was looking at a mirror of his own life's work, mapped out like a target. The director stood up for the first time in the hearing, addressing the diagram with a steady, commanding presence. She declared that the lies, the theatrical performances, the dark financial ties, and the security leaks were not separate failures of character. They were the highly interconnected, smoothly functioning components of a single, massive operation. She accused him of being the master architect of a years-long campaign to weaponize the nation's intelligence apparatus, coordinate with powerful media allies, and manufacture a completely false national reality for his own partisan empowerment. She traced the blue lines, naming specific, prominent journalists across 5 major networks who had secretly received narrative guidance from his office. She traced the red lines, exposing the daily, synchronized messaging coordination with partisan operatives. Most devastatingly, she traced the green lines, identifying former senior intelligence officials who had masqueraded as independent analysts on television while secretly following his pre-written talking points. The American people were told there was a vast conspiracy against our republic, the director stated, her voice echoing through the hushed chamber. You were right about one thing, there was indeed a conspiracy. You were just lying about who was at the center of it. She stepped back, allowing the visual weight of the closed-loop network to sink in. The representative abruptly surged upward from his chair. His chair scraped the floor with a harsh, jarring sound. For a fleeting, agonizing second, he looked toward the main exit doors. It was the primal, unmistakable instinct of a trapped man contemplating flight. But then, his eyes locked onto the battery of camera lenses. He realized in that split second that running away would be the permanent, final image of his career. A coward fleeing from the truth. Slowly, visibly trembling, he lowered himself back into his seat. The cameras captured every second of his hesitation. The director gathered her 5 folders and stacked them into a single, neat pile. She then delivered a series of formal, devastating announcements. She officially referred all evidence of the classified leaks to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act. She submitted a formal referral to the Senate Ethics Committee and recommended the immediate suspension of his security clearances. She turned to him one last time and asked if he wished to respond. Every camera framed his face in a tight shot. Millions of Americans watched. The representative opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He closed it, his jaw working frantically. He opened it again, but his famously sharp rhetorical agility had entirely evaporated. For 15 agonizing seconds of live national television, the man who always had a narrative, the man who had given 423 televised performances, sat in absolute hollow silence. It was not a cinematic silence, it was an empty one. It was the silence of a man discovering that when every single word you've built your life on is proven to be a lie, there are no words left to say. The director did not wait for him. She gathered her briefcase, nodded to the chairman, and walked out through the side entrance, a soldier who had simply completed her mission. The last image before the networks cut to their stunned commentators was the representative sitting alone at the witness table, staring into the void of his own silence. The aftermath was a political and legal landslide. The silence clip went viral globally, viewed over 500 million times in the first 48 hours. The network diagram became a death knell for several media careers within a week. 3 prominent journalists featured on the chart resigned, and several news analysts were pulled from the air. While the legal process began its slow, inevitable march, the political consequences were instantaneous. The representative was stripped of his committee assignments and effectively vanished from the public eye. The man who had dominated the airwaves for 7 years became a ghost in the halls of power. 1 year later, a federal grand jury returned an indictment on multiple counts of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. He became the first sitting senator to face such severe espionage charges in modern history. The trial would eventually prove what the director had demonstrated in that mahogany room, that accountability isn't a partisan concept, it's an operational one. Truth had finally caught up with the narrative, and the architect of the illusion was left with nothing but the deafening echo of his own